Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming this morning. Um, I don't know. I'd just be curious before we start. For everyone who's in this room, can I take a poll of like, is this a group of people who are like, I've never worked with the youth, but I'm curious? Or is this a group of people who are like, I've actually worked with the youth a lot? Who has worked with teenagers, volunteer or employment wise? Okay. And who here has like, I like the teenagers, but I don't know about them yet? Okay. Okay. Curious. So I'm just curious because okay. Well, thank you. Well, I hope I bring exciting things then. um, I will say a lot of what I was thinking about when I put this together was the ways in which I think as adults in the church, we spend a lot of time actually searching for what is going to be the thing that feeds our faith, right? Not only do you go through different seasons of your life and different challenges within those seasons, but there's also a lot of seasons of like, I would call it laying fallow, maybe you might say, or as my uncle would say, waiting for a call, right? Where you're like, faith is important to me. This is an important part of my life, but like, there's not new things that are like stirring up my faith soil at the moment. And like, there are certain times when you're like, I need inspiration, but I'm not sure where to find it. And I've actually found that working with youth, partly because of what it takes to prep for that, and partly because of what it takes to engage with them, has actually been a really fruitful area of how I find I feed my own faith, even though that's not always the specific goal I go into it with. So to talk about that, I'd like to just ask, what makes for a meaningful adult faith? Community or adult faith experiences, adult faith spiritual practices that are grounding, or things that help you create meaning in your life. What would you name as things that are important in creating that experience for you all throughout your adult life? Just a small question. Are there any things that immediately come to mind? Shared values, okay. Community, okay. All of them, okay, okay. So as we talk about some of what I'm going to bring up today, I want you to be thinking about like, what would this, whatever I bring up for what's significant for youth, how does that, and thinking about that and what that brings up in terms of how I would need to prepare for youth, how does that stir up my own faith, right? And kind of upset the waters in a way that is fruitful, okay? So a little context for the conversation. We're about to watch a video in a second here that is by Dr. Lisa Miller. She's a psychologist that studies the neurology and psychology of spirituality, okay? And so what's literally happening in the brain when people have spiritual experiences, okay? And she's going to say a little bit, I'll let her say the thing, but part of how she talks about this, she's couching it a lot in the context of the individual. And that's partly important for what we're going to talk about, but I think it's also important that we are very conscious that we're not just a bunch of individuals here, we're a community, we're specifically a church, you know? And so we're going to be thinking both about the individual experience, but also how individuals in this community work together to create a whole system, right? And that's relevant to, even though that's not exactly how she's talking about it. So, is it working? Cool. So, I show that to you because we're going to reference different parts of it as we go through. Um, nope. That. Haha. So, I think before we say what's up on the screen here, I will say she talks about this in a way that she doesn't mean this, because if you read more of her books, she couches it more carefully than in a 4-minute video. I think she's not trying to convey that, like, in the same way that we've done with physical health, that mental health is somehow a reflection of moral goodness, and that if you're struggling with mental health, that you have personally not attended to your spiritual health or some other thing well enough. She's merely trying to claim that there are ways in which this can help, right? But that it's not like, oh, you're just not being faithful enough or spiritual enough. So just to say that. I will say, what is pulling kids away from faith, even kids who have exposure to the church, right? To some degree, or to a large degree in some cases, grew up in the church. Why is it that we're finding that more and more kids are not finding a spiritual home here, right? And I think there's a couple things. I think one very strong thing is actually that American Christianity, and I know this isn't all of it, but I think it is what a lot of kids see. And when I say American Christianity, I'm talking about, in many cases, white Christian nationalism, really clashes with their values, right? And that they have a hard time hearing, and I think also we sometimes have a hard time conveying the ways in which that's not all of Christianity, or the Christianity that's available to them, right? And so on our side, how can we do more to convey very clearly that is not the Christianity that we're believing in, and we're not just doing it in an oppositional way, we're doing it because we believe in a Christianity that brings us life in a totally different avenue, right? And that we don't just say, like, but I disagree with them. We're like, no, we find what they're doing to be deeply misguided and in some ways perverting the faith. You know, I don't want to, it's not trying to make people into boogeymen, and at the same time, it's trying to be clear about values and morality, like we talked about, because it is things that youth are very concerned with, right? If Christianity is actually about a morality of hate, well, no, they're not going to get on board, you know? So how do we make it clear that not only do we disagree, but we're actively working to change the narrative, right? Not just within these four walls, but out in the wider national conversation, right? On top of that, I think there is a less of a push to have faith be a meaningful part of youth's lives. I think that's cultural across the board, right? So they don't necessarily hear it from a lot of their peers or their peers' family. Parents who do try and push that hard can sometimes feel like they're being like, my kids are like, you're just forcing me to, you know? And you're like, no, I'm just trying to help, you know? So it can be a bit of a catch-22 for parents at times as to what to do. And then I think most important is part of what Lisa talked about, that thing of, like, we spend so much time doing what I'm going to call goal prep, right? That we're prepping them for what we think will be the things they want to achieve in later life. And it's not that I don't believe in that. I do believe in that. Like, to the extent of, like, yes, you should go to school because it turns out you use that stuff, you know, even the things that people are like, you'll never use that. There's always a moment later where you're like, shucks, I used that, you know? Or at least if you're paying attention, you should find a way to use it, right? So I think that is important, but I think it's really important that we recognize that what we do here in the church is life prep too, right? The thing we know kids will do is they will become adults, and they will have moments of joy and moments of deep struggle. And that if we're not giving them the foundation to know how to have something to ground themselves with and guide themselves with at that moment, that those moments will be even harder than they need to be, right? Because it will be hard one way or the other. So just to refocus our attention, just claiming people's value is not merely in their goals and productivity. I am a little bit calling out the ways in which capitalism can take over narratives in our lives, where you are a producer, not a human, right? But our value is in our relationships, our human spirit, our faith. Nobody gets to a mortality scare or their actual mortality and is like, well, if only I'd stayed at work longer and gotten more paperwork done. I was talking to a guy who was like, my boss could give me any amount of work and I'd get it done. And I was like, yay? Like, That's cool. You do you, but I'm not gonna. So I want to talk here about a thing called dark academia. The question I think that's important is, what is the gap between what kids are seeking out and what we're actually offering? So this is a thing that's come up recently. It's a subculture for young millennials, Gen Z, and it's an aesthetic, right? So it is about the clothes you wear and the way you style yourself. It's very like Cambridge in the 1930s and Tweed and Dead Poets Society and all this stuff, right? Like it's high nerd, okay? And it's not to say that any of the specific youth in our church are specifically doing dark academia, but the fact that it's showing up and there are other things like it that show up, right? What it's about is also a set of values. And those values are about a love of learning and an appreciation for the humanities and what they can teach us, and thinking that what the humanities teaches us is practical to everyday life. It's about considering the appreciation of nature and the love of the sacred, small, and cozy, right? And so you hear the people who are really into this talk in a really interesting way, actually. So let me just read you a little excerpt. This is one guy posting on Twitter, and he says, what I love about dark academia is that we value knowledge and learning so much. We appreciate learning and school or university as something magical as it should be. We romanticize the act of learning about old tales and history like we used to romanticize everything else. But this time it's so useful, and I think that's beautiful. Okay? And then another person says, sometimes I read a phrase in a poem or story, or I see the clouds amble in the sky traced by sunlight, or I hear a specific combination of notes on a piano. And I just get so overwhelmed with a really specific feeling that I can't really name, but I know that this feeling is so human and so tender, and at its core that I am a tiny little part of a world so delightfully rich with sensations, and I exist to experience this very feeling because it stems from the pure human love for coexistence with the world. And this is interesting because what it reminds me of, I was watching these videos, and the other thing that they kept saying is that there were several people doing videos who were snipped together, and they kept on being like, blankety blank is so desperately beautiful. And it made me think of Anne of Green Gables, like from the 1985 version, right? Where like everything is desperately amazing. And I always found it to be like over the top for Anne of Green Gables to talk that way. But on the other hand, I'm like, a tiny part of me understands you, Anne. You know, like, it is desperately beautiful. And I think it's interesting because what they're really talking about here, right, is a sense of like deep connectedness to the beauty of being alive, right? And to the humanity of it, and to the ways in which that both includes great highs and also great lows, and that there's richness in appreciating the moments that we have, right? And so there is a way in which kids/young people are really seeking this experience out. The very things that we would be like, oh no, but that's what the church offers, guys. That's totally the thing we do, you know? But there is a question of why is what we think we're offering not connecting with what they're seeking, right? What is gapping there between the two? So we're going to talk now briefly about some very practical elements that research has shown helps kids see where the church offers connection, right? And they're going to be, in some ways, very practical and mundane, okay? So there was 3 studies that together asked very similar questions, and together they were looking at about 11,000 youth across the country, mostly in mainline Protestant churches, okay? And this was quite recent, in the last 10 years or so. And they were saying, what are the things that are most predictive for kids growing up and not only having a mature faith, but potentially being active in their faith communities as adults? And what they found was 4 things, one of which pertains most to families, so it's not here, but the other 3 pertain definitely to the life of the church together. And the first is having 5 significant relationships in church beyond family, right? And I think what to say there is that this is not even saying that like you have to have 5 people who are constantly taking you out to coffee and like know every little thing about you and like we're besties. It's that there are 5 people in the community who are really tracking you personally and focused, right? And that you can tell that like they know you and they know stuff about you, And you might only pick it up because they're talking to you and to your parents in front of you. But like you're aware that like you're not just another youth to them who's familiar, but they know you, okay? And it can be, yeah, if you want to go out to coffee, please do. But considering what is available, I think this is important to consider because it's really about anchoring them in the community, right? That it's not just family that's interested in them, but there's this, what feels, I'm hoping to them, like a spontaneous sense of belovedness, right? I'll say for myself, in growing up, there were probably people who I only really appreciated what they were doing as I hit my 20s, right? And by the time I hit 30, I was like, that person is kind of amazing, you know? But I realized what they'd been doing since I was a young teenager, right? And so it wasn't that I thought at the time of being a teenager that I was really tracking, wow, that person's taking an interest. But I did know it, even if I wasn't like putting my finger on it, okay? And so how is that an important part of like what we all need from each other, right? Because we only learn our sense of belovedness from God by learning it from each other, right? That's how it becomes a real sense. So how do we do that? How do we model Christian relationship for them? And then I'll say the second is worship attendance. And this is not about being physically present, okay? I mean, yes, do be physically present, but that's not the magical element of it, you know? It is about, yes, that we do worship in a way that is also spiritually relevant and meaningful for young people, right? So like, it's not like we're like, well, we let you come, you know? But it is being somewhat responsive, but it's also simply that we not just make room for them, but we provide the push, provide the meaningful welcome once they're there, right? So that if they're like, and usually they are like this, they're like, we like a lot of this worship, you know, once kids get used to it. They may be like, there are bits of it that we really don't get, you know, and that we as a community find some ways to be responsive, right? Even if it's not to every point, but that we show meaningfully, like we're really listening. We're not just like, thanks you told us. We're going to put that feedback form in the back, you know? So I think that this is surprising. It was surprising to me that worship attendance was such a predictor. But on the other hand, it's not surprising, right? Worship is one of the two core things we do as a community, right? We worship together because there are other ways you could argue this, but one good one I've heard is it's what helps us reorient ourselves communally towards what God is asking of us, right? So that we're all pointing back in the same direction as a community, right? We're not just here together, we're here focused together, okay? And so inviting youth into that, I think, is really important, that they feel like they're increasingly a part of the meaningful part of how we live out Christianity together. And the third thing rather, is living out your faith in action, right? Which is the second big thing we do together. And what Lisa talked about in terms of altruism, right? And that could be volunteering at a volunteer opportunity, sure. It could be working in the Sunday school. It could be, I saw this a lot this weekend, just they're being very conscious in a social situation about how you make room for others, right? And so for teens and for all of us, sometimes that's not bad altruism, right? About being intentional about inviting others into our space. But whatever it is, it needs to be something that feels like it's meaningfully something that matters, right? It shouldn't be opportunities that are like, someone else could easily do this and it wouldn't really matter, you know, who it is, right? Or I bring nothing of myself to this, or the worst of them, which shows up in high school, which is like, I did this because it will look good on a college application, right? Which is not to say like, I don't kind of get that, but I'm also like, how are we helping kids understand on those gap activities? There are some things that I'm like, they do matter, but sometimes youth don't know why they matter. So how do we help them know that, right? Or how are we giving them opportunities that they already are like, but this matters to me, can you help me facilitate it, right? So one example of this that's coming up in just a little bit is we have more than one youth that's been helping with the rollout of the recycling and compost project that we're trying to get into the church so that we have better ways to separate our waste, right? And it does matter to them. They're going to be here for a long time, right? And so they are like, yes, I want to see in this small way that we live out our values, and I can contribute, okay? So these are some big things. I will say, outside of what this study told, I'm going to add one, which is a wider sense of spirituality beyond the bounds of religious practice. I think this is really important for youth because I think a couple reasons. First of all, I think we have to acknowledge that historically, people's spiritual experience was not limited to the church, right? I think right now there's this narrative that either your faith is or should be just your religion, right? But in fact, historically people had a lot more time to be in nature, to be physically, dynamically active, to engage in stories outside of faith that were meaningful, whether that was myth or fables or all kinds of other things, and to be really rooted in communities that knew them well and were wider than their families, right? But knew them pretty intimately. And all of those things would have fed into people's faith and spirituality, right? Also, they had more time off. You know, the average medieval farmer in like the 1500s worked 150 days a year. We work 260, okay? So I think we overestimate the ways in which we should be relying only on this for our spirituality. And I'll give an example of what I mean by a wider sense of spirituality. I'll say for myself, and you could get a very different answer for this. If I was going to name what is my spirituality in addition to my Christian faith, I would say a study of history and how that informs my sense of not only what it means to be human, but the ways in which I see prophetic voice reaching beyond the Bible, right? I would say Mr. Rogers. I would say Star Trek. I would say biking, okay? And some of those, I don't know, they might sound kind of silly, right? But on the other hand, I'm like, these aren't just stories that I like. These are things that have transformed me in some way. That are so deeply rooted that they changed the way I saw the world over the course of my life. And I see it from a different perspective because they formed me as I came up, you know? So what would be those things that we would be asking of youth, right? How do we help them think about their experience of being human and of being spiritual creatures beyond just a religion, right? Especially for youth who, one way or the other, some youth are going to be like, but the Christian story doesn't connect for me, you know? And those youth especially need to have a sense of what is my deeper sense of spirituality, even if it's potentially in a very secular way, right? So I think that's something I'd really like to be pushing, and I think that we as adults should be asking ourselves so that we can share that with youth, right? And give them that gift of being like, we're not just saying you should feel this way, we're saying we have searched for ourselves in our hearts about what else matters that much to us, right? And then I'll just say the final thing. This is a question that we ask confirmands towards the end of the year. We ask, what do you point your heart toward? And we ask this because the word belief comes out, the etymology comes out of German, and part of how that etymology can be translated is this question, you know? You could also ask, what do you give your heart to? But I think this one has a slightly better clarity for youth who sometimes when we ask them, what do you give your heart to? They're like, I don't have a boyfriend or girlfriend. And you're like, that's not what I mean. But what do you point your heart towards, right? And how would we answer that as adults, right? And it might be more than one answer, and in many cases I would assume it would be, right? And it could change over the course of our lives. I'd say over the last 5 years, something I hadn't experienced before, but I would say now, is working for different kinds of intersectional justice, right? Whether that's racial or gendered or sexual or whatever, right? The ways in which that itself is becoming a core part of how I understand my faith, right? And so it could be that. It could be things like family, right? But whatever it is, it's actually got a broad set of things you could point your heart towards. It's a question of what's meaning the highest value to you now, that you are like, that's what I spend my time and attention on, and I think about constantly because it matters so greatly to me, right? So I'll just wrap up by saying, this question can be important because youth themselves are kind of wondering this about the church and about us. Like I said, they sometimes can get American general Christianity confused with what they see here in House of Hope or other churches they have access to. And I think the ways in which we're very clear about answering these questions and saying, this is actually what we point our heart towards. It's not the things that you might see in a wider cultural context across the US. Can be really important for how they form their own faith. And that this is part of why I work with youth, right? It's very cool to work with youth and have to think about these things and be very intentional about how we lay it out before them so that they have some access points when they haven't had a lot of on-ramps, right? They might have been going to church and stuff, but a lot of the culture is, let's say, making on-ramps bumpy, okay? And so we're trying to be very thoughtful about how we do that, and that for me, in thinking that out, is very fruitful for my own faith. But it's also really cool to see the youth as they start to put this together for themselves, right? Live out their own gifts and contribute their own aspects to the church and our communal life together in very unique ways, and ways that you're like, for all the intentionality I or anyone else puts into this, you're like, that wasn't me, that was you. But somehow you put that together in a very unique way from the things welling up within you, and that it's really a privilege to see, right? And so it's been very cool over the last 9 months to start to get to know the House of Hope youth. And I just encourage you to think about, like, what are the parts of this that really connect for you, either for your own spiritual life right now, or for the ways that you're like, wow, I miss working with youth. They're kind of cool, right? Because the more voices that are in that mix are really going to matter. And even if you're like, I just want to show up for like a thing or two, as always, we're going to invite you, okay? Because it really does matter. The more that the youth perceive like, wow, the church as a whole, all are invested in us. So thank you all for your time this morning. And are we meant to do question and answer or no? Yeah? Yeah.
I'm pleased to hear that
Yeah.
you're working with the youth
Yeah.
on recycling.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that when we get to that point, you could have an enrichment session where the youth teach the old people how to separate and recycle.
Yeah, no, and we were hoping to do that, so that's another thing we should follow up on, yeah. Because I think it's one of those things that, like, I think for a lot of youth, the whole environmental aspect, I think it can feel very desperate, and like a betrayal when they don't see people following through, because they're like, wow, it's really, if you don't do this, nothing else matters, right? And they know that there's a lot of other big things coming up the pike that have not been addressed either, right? And so I think in good faith, we want to be like, no, we're on it, guys. We're getting on it, in all the small ways we can, because I think it shows our faithfulness towards their future, too. So, yeah, thank you. Anyone? Yeah. 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 Hmm. Yeah. Yes, and I'm kind of making it up myself. And it's not because there aren't good other things out there, it's that I'm mixing and matching. We do still use those questions at time of confirmation. It is in the liturgy itself, and so like we're kind of mandated to use them. But the things that we're focusing on this year, and to be fair, I'm reshuffling this year, so we'll see how it all goes. But we're going to do 4 sections: one on community, one on awe, one on justice, and one on practice, as in spiritual practice. Okay. Historically, when I did this at other churches, we'd do God, Jesus, the Holy Spirit, and pretty much that. And it's not that that's not a good idea. In many ways, it is a good idea. But I think that we're trying to strike a balance between giving youth room to really explore their beliefs. And as an example of that, we're going from talking about a statement of faith to a reflection on beliefs, right? So that even if they choose to not become an adult member of the church, and they might even be like, and I can't say much about the Christian story, that we still say, please do write a statement of belief, because you have beliefs of some kind, you know? And we're hoping that this year we're going to post all their faith statements without their names, but that so you as the congregation can see what's going through the minds of some of our youth right now, right? What are they finding to be most important, both in the world and in terms of their spiritual connection, either to our community, the story, or whatever it is that they find important, right? So we're working on those 4 themes and hoping that those themes allow ins to not only exploring their own heart and mind beliefs, right, but not just mind beliefs, but also giving them room to work on spiritual practice as a really important element of setting them up for future life, and also giving them room to think about those work-related, justice-related aspects of faith, right? The active elements of faith, right? So both justice itself and community are both meant to give them access to that conversation and to being active in it. And they have a little gap in the spring of a few weeks when they're meant to do a service project we're not meeting for those few weeks, and then they're meant to use that time to do a service project of some kind, right? No, that hasn't been our practice for actually a lot of years. Like, I mean, if they were like, I don't believe in any of this, but I'd like to join the church, I think when they meet with the session, we're moving towards a model where like 2-3 session members meet with 2-3 confirmands, and they've read those 3 statements and they know whose they are, you know, and then they have a conversation for 30-40 minutes on that confirmation Saturday. And so if they were to write that, probably I too, would be like, you know, let's have a coffee, talk about like, what about it? Why do you want to be a member of the church if this doesn't fit? Honestly, I think that even if they have a good answer and they're like, it's not like that they were thinking unclearly, they just are like, but I do really want to commit to this community, I'd be like, do it, you know? Because theologically, Presbyterians are meant to agree to some very core things, but then have latitude beyond that. But I want to confirm them not because we're like begging for numbers, but more so because I'm like, if you feel like this community is a place you belong, we think you belong here, right? And you will find a way to fit into the midst of what we're doing, whether you think of that in a faith-oriented way or not, you know? And so, yeah, we would totally confirm them. Yeah. Anything else? I think a couple things. I think in a very practical sense, we've had several leaders who have been extremely faithful with the program for 5 to 15 years or beyond. And those leaders, it's not that necessarily some of them or all of them are like, and I'm out, you know? But I recognize like that is a very long term of faithfulness in many cases. And so we are wanting to expand the pool so that A, the weight's not on all that small handful of leaders. B, there is more voices in the mix. And also, we have more of a spread of demographics, right? So like, we're looking for people who are older and willing to come and hang out, right? If you're like, I'm 85, but I'd do it, like, yeah, please do, you know? If we find people who are young adults and want to come, we'd love that too, right? Because like, there are some of our volunteers who are older and like still want to play the running games, and I'm like, wow, good on ya, you know? But like, if you're like, no, I'm not going to play the running games, that doesn't lose your value in the youth size, right? They're like, we're glad you're here with us, and you can be the person who monitors timeouts when people get tagged out, okay? So those are all really relevant things, and so we do want to expand that pool for the many ways, both practically and emotionally, it adds in. I think we're also trying to find ways to help youth be in the service, right? And the youth at House of Hope haven't, as I understand it, and I'm happy to be told differently, haven't really had, like Sunday school has for many years been during the service, and so they haven't really grown up in the service, and so it's very unfamiliar to them. And whether it's youth age kids or even kids in upper elementary, some parents are like, ooh, I'd like to have my kid go to the service, or I'm willing to give it a try, whichever. And when they put it before the youth, or when I put it before the youth, because I've started this thing where every other Sunday I'd like them to sit together in the service with me, and then every other Sunday we'll help in the Sunday school, right? But convincing the youth to be like, let's go and sit in the service together is a hard sell right now, right? And so, and it makes sense. I mean, it's not like there's a magical age where you're like, you know what I'd like to do? Sit quietly in the service. And especially because they spend all week sitting quietly in school, So that's tricky. And we do have a service that it's not like sensory overloaded, our service, frankly. Like there's beautiful music, but it's not all five senses are engaged and you're like, wow, it's like being on a roller coaster, So it's not to say that that's what it needs to be, but it is to say that it is a slightly higher bar for them to figure out what is happening and connects to them, right? So I think communally we need to think creatively, and I really do mean communally in the sense of like I would like some inspiration around this, if people have input to offer about like how do we communally do invitations to them, so it's not just me being like you should go to the service, but also how do we figure out how to make space for them in the service. It's going to take a while, even when they are in the service, for them to have a thought on it, other than like, that's long, like that probably will be their first thought, but at some point they're going to find things they connect to and things that they are like, I don't know about that bit, and in that case, then how do we give them an in? And the example of this is Youth Sunday, right? In every church I've ever been in, they do the Youth Sunday, and they're like, you can do anything you want during Youth Sunday. You can just go crazy with it. And the youth are like, I've only seen the one thing. So we're going to reproduce the one thing, right? I did, when I was in Youth Sunday. And so we have to give them both the familiarity and then have a good amount of like engagement with them to be able to offer them the other things we've seen, right? Or to be able to be like, what about that doesn't connect for you? What might feel interesting? What are other things that I've found meaningful, right? For a lot of us, we spend a lot of time trying to figure out what are spiritual practices that matter, right? For some people, it's a labyrinth, For other people, it's, I don't know, another thing, whatever. But whatever it is, like, just helping kids think about, like, there are more than one way, more ways than one to worship, right? And this is one, but you can also mix and match in the same thing. And there are ways that even they might find interesting that actually wouldn't be so distant from what a lot of the congregation feels comfortable with. It would just be different, but it would still feel akin to something that feels familiar, right? It's not like everything has to be praise bands, and frankly, I don't think our youth would ever pick praise bands, So I think we sometimes feel anxious that they're going to pick something really, what feels like spiritually or mood-wise foreign to us, and I'm like, no, they probably won't. Like, they're here because they like it here, But they do still have places to find more points of connection. Is that helpful for that? Okay. So I think those are two of the main things right now, is figuring out how to widen that volunteer pool and build more connections, deep connections, and then also figuring out how to help the youth go into service and also help the children start to have opportunities to go into the service. And for children, that might mean having a way that they very close to the sanctuary or in the sanctuary have a way to move in and out of a wiggle space, right? So that they can sit sometimes, and then when they become like, I can't anymore, they have a space right next to it that they can, or in it, that they can move to, wiggle around some, make some low-key noise with some carpets that deaden it, but also still be present, right? And there's a kid I know who's 3, who loves going to his church. It's not this, I'm not saying you couldn't, but like, it's a different church he goes to. And he like loves it. And I'm like, wow, what are they doing at that church that like this 3-year-old is like, I just can't get enough of it, I don't think it's anything bonus special, is my guess. Like, I'm gonna talk to his mom and be like, I'd love to know the specifics of what they've set up, but it sounds like they have a wiggle space in the sanctuary, and that the kid feels good, like, being there, and that the mom doesn't feel like it's like another job, right? Where like you come and you're like, now I just have to make sure my kid doesn't get too loud the whole hour, you know? So like, how are we, massaging those spaces and trying them out and giving a little room to try it out, you know? So yeah. It's a, no. Yeah, no, no, right now, my job description is just the youth, so it's 6th grade through technically 12th. We might start doing a post-high school group for kids who are just have graduated high school or maybe are in college at this point, to keep giving them like meaningful points of fellowship and connection here at the church, right? But at the moment, because we don't have a children's director, just over the last few weeks, I've had a lot more points of contact with the children, and these are questions that like we're recognizing in terms of how we support parents and or any person who's helping to volunteer with the Sunday school, which like last week when we did the Moment for Mission, we're serious. We really want to build that team too, even if you only want to volunteer for one Sunday a month or something. We want to build that team so that it's not only parents who are having to facilitate that program, you know? But we've been trying to figure out, how do we do some shuffles? Because there was, as we started the year, we realized that Kira had built a beautiful program, but at the same time, there were elements of it that were more dependent on Kira than we had recognized, right? And so how do we do just a little bit of massaging that allows other people to do it in a way that works for them? And that does take some like shuffle, because Kira had some very specific skills that you can't just like be like any parent come in and master that right away, you know? So wanting to figure out how that kind of massages and recognizing that at any time of transition, it's a good time to be like, there are things we've been thinking about. The whole conversation about worship is something I'd been thinking about for the youth, but I recognized there was a parent who told me that they wanted to bring their 4th and 5th grader in, you know? And that their 4th and 5th graders were like, no, you know? And so I was like, oh, okay, so we actually do need to back that timeline up even more. Very small kids, I can't remember if I went to children's church when I was a kid. I'd have to ask my mom, right? But I know that from like middle elementary at least, if not younger on, like for me personally, and this is somewhat specific to my family, I was expected to be in the service. Also, I was bad at crafts, and I hated crafts. So I couldn't go and do the children things. So other children might be more gifted. But at any rate, like figuring out how we give those options, right? Because there are certain Sundays that you're going to be like, the right choice is a children's church or a wiggle space or a Sunday school during this time. And there are other Sundays when you're like, I do want to, my kid is up for it, and like this is a chance when they can start being part of this larger experience. So. I mean, you tell me. Yeah. I mean, I think the thing is that I'm not against that, and at the same time, I recognize sometimes we do the deacons in session will take care of it thing, you know? And I don't know the full scope on House of Hope, right? But there are ways in which, at least for some people on those committees, they end up getting like really committed all of a sudden, because they're like, no, I'm going to do the job really well, you know? And I know that there are some parents in the youth program who that's very true for, right? And I just want to make sure that like, we don't deathly overburden those committees, if that's a thing that could be true. Or how do we like spread it in a way that like, I really want the whole congregation to feel like, wow, I don't just like seeing kids here, I like knowing these kids, you know? And feeling like they're ours and mine, right? Because I think that's true. We're gonna introduce a new little response to baptism after the whole like, do you promise to blah, blah, blah exchange, that we'll say as a congregation about how we promise to love, encourage, and support them, to share the good news of the gospel with them, to serve that gospel alongside them, right? It's slightly different languages. I'm hearing it from my childhood, the one I used to know. But I think, I mean, like to me, saying that, I was saying it the other day, and someone was like, "You have that memorized?" And I was like, "No, but I do." I get really emotional about that, right? And we had a confirmand who decided not to join last year, and she was saying, blah blah blah. And I'm like, "No, that's really fine. But like, just so you know, we're always your community, whether you choose to be with us or not, right? We've committed to you. This is covenantal, right? You can choose to reciprocate that, but we will always be here for you." And so I want us to be thinking of it that way, partly because it matters for the youth, but partly because I think it's really enlivening for our faith. So I don't want to keep you too long. You probably want lunch, yeah.